You know, when you think of Canada, you probably picture a pretty safe and peaceful country, right? Well, for the most part, you'd be right. But today, we're going to dig into the data that tells a more complicated story. It's a story about specific cities where crime rates are on the rise and are becoming a real concern for the people who live there.
This quote right here just gets straight to the heart of it. Look, don't get me wrong, Canada is still safer than the US overall. But this statement highlights a growing and uncomfortable reality. In certain cities, that feeling of safety is starting to slip away. And this isn't just a feeling people have. The numbers back it up. The national data doesn't lie. Violent crime, up 4%. The overall crime severity index has been climbing for 3 straight years. And maybe the biggest shocker of all, the homicide rate is the highest it's been since 1992. These aren't just blips on the radar, these are sustained, documented trends.
So, before we jump into our countdown of the top 10 cities, it is absolutely crucial that we're all on the same page about how we measure danger. It's not just about counting up every single crime, it's about understanding how serious those crimes are.
So, the main tool we're going to be using is the Crime Severity Index, or CSI for short. It's a really smart metric from Statistics Canada. See, instead of treating all crimes equally, it gives more weight to serious violent stuff like assaults and homicides. That gives us a much more accurate picture of what's really going on. For this ranking, we'll be using a specific crime index that's derived from all that data, which just lets us line these cities up and compare them apples to apples.
You ready? Let's dive right into this countdown, starting with numbers 10 down to 6. Kicking off our list at number 10 is London, Ontario. You know, its location is a bit of a double-edged sword. It's right on that major highway corridor between Toronto and Detroit, and unfortunately, that's made it a hub for drug trafficking and organized crime, which is really fueling a noticeable problem with violent crime.
Sliding in at number 9, we've got Brampton. Now, this is one of Canada's fastest-growing cities, and that kind of explosive growth can really strain city resources, especially the police. Plus, being so close to Toronto has made it a prime spot for organized crime, and it's become particularly infamous for its sky-high rates of car theft.
Okay, now number 8 is Kamloops, and this one is a bit of a statistical bombshell. While its overall crime index is high, check out its actual crime severity index. It's over 165. That is one of the highest in the entire country. And what that tells us is that the crimes happening here are especially serious, mostly driven by a devastating meth and opioid crisis that fuels a staggering amount of both violent and property crime.
Coming in hot at number 7 is Hamilton. You know, its story is really tied to the decline of its historic steel industry. When those jobs left, economic hardship followed, and that, combined with a really severe opioid crisis, has led to soaring rates of property crime. People are stealing just to support their habits, or frankly, just to get by. And at number 6, we have Sault Ste. Marie. It's a very similar story to Hamilton, one of economic decline, but its problem is compounded by its geographic isolation way up in northern Ontario. That means fewer resources, which makes it harder to tackle the severe drug problems that are driving a very, very high rate of property crime.
All right, take a breath. We are now entering the top 5. These are the cities with the most significant and persistent safety challenges in the entire country. Kicking off the top 5 is Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan. The defining issue here, plain and simple, is violent gang conflict. These rivalries are the engine behind the city's high rates of assault and robbery, and they create some really intense safety concerns in certain neighborhoods.
Number 4 is Greater Sudbury, and the data here is, well, it's kinda upside down. In most places, property crime is much more common than violent crime. Not here. Violent crime actually outpaces nonviolent crime by nearly 2 to 1. And this is almost entirely fueled by a widespread substance abuse epidemic, creating a level of violence that is frankly alarming.
Taking our number 3 spot is Winnipeg. For years now, this city has held the pretty grim distinction of having one of the highest homicide rates among all major Canadian cities. The reason? Deeply entrenched gang activity that controls the drug trade and drives a huge portion of this violence.
Our runner-up at number 2 is Kelowna, and this city is a true paradox. On the one hand, it's this absolutely beautiful tourist paradise, but on the other, it is plagued by what you can only call an epidemic of property crime. We're talking widespread theft, vandalism, break-ins, all fueled by a severe drug crisis that creates very visible street disorder right in the heart of this resort town.
And that brings us to number 1. Topping our ranking as the most dangerous city in Canada is Surrey, British Columbia. It has the highest crime index on our list, period.
It's dealing with deeply entrenched, incredibly violent gang wars. And on top of all that, it just saw an alarming 14% surge in violent crime. This isn't just a bad year, it's a sustained, elevated level of danger.
So, there you have it, the top 10. We've gone from Ontario to Saskatchewan to BC, from huge metro areas to smaller towns. So the real question is, why? What are the common threads that connect a place like Surrey to a place like Sudbury and land them both on this list?
Let's try to connect some of these dots. It turns out there are several powerful factors that just keep popping up again and again in these high-crime cities. But here's the most important thing to understand. None of these issues happen in a vacuum. They're all connected, like a chain reaction. Think about it. Those gang conflicts we saw in Regina and Surrey, they thrive on the drug trade. That substance abuse, it's often directly linked to the economic desperation we heard about in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie. And that rapid growth that strained police resources in Brampton, that just makes it even harder to break these repeating cycles of crime.
Okay, so we've gone through the list and we've looked at the causes. But before we wrap this up, we absolutely have to pull back and look at the bigger picture. Because when we talk about numbers like these, context is everything. And this really illustrates that point perfectly. Take Surrey's crime index, 64.7, the highest in Canada. Now, compare that to a U.S. city like Memphis, which has a crime index of 78. So yeah, even our worst is still significantly safer than many comparable cities south of the border.
But, and this is probably the single most important takeaway, for the people actually living in Canada, that comparison doesn't make their streets feel any safer. The internal trends are what matter. The rising violence, the highest homicide rate in 30 years, and the epidemic of property crime, these represent a very real decline in public safety within the Canadian context.
So what does all this mean for you? Well, it's not about living in fear, it's about navigating with awareness. It means knowing which neighborhoods might carry a higher risk, taking simple steps to secure your home and your car, just being aware of your surroundings, and reporting suspicious activity when you see it. These are practical things that can really lower your personal risk.
So that's where things stand. The data, the trends, they're all pointing in one pretty worrying direction for Canada's urban centers. The question really isn't what is happening anymore. We know that. The real question is, will the country find the collective will to change course?